You're in the water loop.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Hey everyone, this is Travis with Waterloop. I know a lot of people want to use water-efficient fixtures, but they're afraid they won't work as well. Let me tell you about High Sierra showerheads, which was named Best Showerhead by Popular Science. I just installed one at my house and I was genuinely surprised at the power and coverage of the water. High Sierra showerheads earn the EPA WaterSense label for water efficiency. They use at least 40% less water than the conventional low-flow showerheads. High Sierra showerheads are constructed out of metal, so there's no plastic involved, they're very durable, and they're naturally antibacterial. One of my favorite things, these showerheads are made in the USA by a small business located in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Get 20% off with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. I am a big fan of history. I like to travel around and check out history wherever I go. And so I'm glad to be joined for this episode by Sharee Williamson. She is Senior Associate General Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Sharee, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, glad to hear you're doing well and glad to have you on here. Like I said, I'm a big fan of history, and a lot of our family day trips and even vacations we plan around seeing historic sites and all that kind of stuff. So I was interested in reaching out to you all because I saw some articles about climate change, the water impacts of climate change, and how they threaten, a lot of historic places around the country. And so I look forward to digging into that. But kind of backing way up, a historic place. What's considered a historic place?
Yes, that is a good question. And there are lots of answers to that question. There are tons of types of historic places. I think people think about, houses and buildings and structures when they think historic preservation, but it's not just that. There's also archaeology, there's cultural landscapes. What a cultural landscape is a landscape where there's evidence of human intervention. There can be formal ones, think like gardens at Versailles, right? That's a cultural landscape. Or there can be natural ones that show just evidence of human habitation over thousands of years. So what is a historic place? Lots of different places. I was thinking too that, there are places of different levels of historic significance. That's the way that the preservation movement thinks about things. They think about federal, state, and local history. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about you like to go on day trips, I don't know if you seek out national parks or state parks or local landmarks, but all those places are historic places. And I just sort of simply too that, what is a historic place? It's a place that's important to the community around it, because that's how historic places get preserved. So
yeah, awesome. What's your organization's approach, the National Trust for Historic Preservation? What's your approach, and how do you generally try to achieve that protection of these kind of places?
Yeah, so the National Trust was founded by Congress in 1949, and one of our mandates from Congress when we were founded was to engage the public in participating in historic preservation. So just from the start, when we get involved in saving a particular historic place, we start with partners. So we look at the local communities that are interested in it. So there are local historical groups, there are local museums. We work with statewide partners around the country. So we're a national preservation organization, but there are statewide preservation nonprofits in most of the states around the country. I'm based in the DC area, and here we have strong statewide partners in Maryland, Preservation Maryland, and in Virginia, Preservation Virginia, and also in DC Preservation League. So we reach out and we work with others and talk to the communities. We also work really closely with government agencies. So I'm not sure how familiar folks are generally with the regulatory schemes that exist for preservation, but there actually are. And there's federal laws that mandate preservation approaches for federal agencies. So we work with agencies across the government, but often ones affiliated with DOI and the Park Service. The National Park Service is a major one. And then there's state historic preservation offices in every state. And there are also tribal historic preservation offices for tribes. So we also work with these regulators to try and make sure that we get good preservation outcomes. In addition to sort of identifying these partners, we also we do a lot of legal and policy advocacy work. Our headquarters is in DC, and I myself, in my role at the Trust, work a lot on legal and policy advocacy. So we will advocate for strong federal laws in particular to preserve historic places. We will advocate for funding, and we will advocate for strong enforcement of these laws. So like a good example, last week, Congress passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which is a major funding bill, like sort of one of the biggest funding bills for the parks in decades.
A lot of people are very excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so our government relations team advocated very strongly for that. It's something that we've worked on for years and supported because so much of the maintenance backlog at the National Park Service is actually maintenance of historic resources that are under their care.
Okay. Wow. Great. Well, I appreciate you giving some of that context as to what historic places are, how your organization works. I just learned a ton there. So pivoting to water a little bit, what are some examples of historic places, national treasures that connect to water? I mean, I spent some time going through your website and saw a number of them on there. A lot of places I'm happy that I've been myself. But yeah, could you talk about some places that jump out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I jump in, I feel like I should explain what a national treasure is. So that's another one of the ways that Trust does our advocacy work. So we will identify sites around the country that are either facing some sort of threat or they have some major opportunity to get a good preservation result. And they're places of national significance. And if you check out our website, we've got places around the country. You're right, a lot of them actually do have a connection with water. I was thinking about that after you pointed it out and why that might be. And I think it's because people are drawn to water, and historic communities are often built around water. And there are a lot of examples of that. But yeah, I mean, for one of my favorite ones recently is the Ghost Fleet of the Potomac National Treasure. And what that is underwater shipwrecks in Mallows Bay in the Potomac, just about 40 miles south of Washington, D.C. And late last year, it was finalized as the nation's newest national marine sanctuary. And that one is really interesting. The ships that are there's about 100 ships that are there. And because of the way they were scuttled there, most of them are the remains of a commercial fleet that was built for World War I. And so they were scuttled there. That's why there's such a high concentration. It's not that they wrecked there, it's that they were wrecked there. But at low tide, they actually will emerge out of the water. And it is a park that is available. It's now a National Marine Sanctuary, but it has always been also a regional park, Charles County, Maryland's regional park. It's got a great kayak and boat launch, and you can paddle around amongst, history, and also see some really, it's a really great habitat for animals and for the Chesapeake Bay as well. I went out there earlier this summer and saw osprey everywhere.
Wow. That's a cool place. I have not been to that one. I've seen pictures and everything. And I used to live in that general area. So maybe I'll have to make my way out there. That sounds like a fun place to paddle around at low tide and see some of that. I wanted to rattle off some of the ones that jumped out at me off your website also that, just for people's context, the James River, Jamestown, the big famous colony is a place. the Grand Canyon, right? This is one of the world's wonders that was carved by the Colorado River. You have Waikiki War Memorial Natatorium in Hawaii, which is a really interesting place that I hope gets preserved. Willamette Falls Navigation Canal in Oregon, and you also have Terminal Island in LA. So there's just like, it kind of goes on and on. There's all these incredible places that, like you said, are like the interface between the water and human civilization on land. Well, I guess to some of the bad news, how are water-related impacts of climate change, impacting historical places? This is really what jumped out at me and why I wanted to reach out to your organization.
Yeah, historic places are experiencing the same kinds of threats that communities around the country and around the world are. They suffer from flooding, extreme rain events. Coastal communities are suffering and trying to figure out ways to mitigate challenges with sea level rise. So, in particular, for historic communities, there are a lot of our coastal communities are also have historic centers, and some examples of that are, Charleston, South Carolina is a well-known example. It's a very well-visited, frequently visited tourist destination for people in the U.S. and around the world. That downtown historic district is actually a National Historic Landmark. And it is to the point with sea level rise flooding there that, they have blue sky flooding. So they have flooding just as a matter of course, not as a result of rain events, but just at high tide. And it's repeated. It's interesting. I've seen some historic maps of Charleston. And if you look at some of these older maps, you'll see that the peninsula where the NHL district is used to be smaller. And the reason is that it was broadened out with fill. And then people have built on fill. And so if you look at these old maps without the fill, and then you look at today's maps of where the highest incidences of flooding are, there's a complete overlap of those two issues. So that's another way that sort of short-term planning has contributed to some of the challenges that are being faced in the community there. And that's a kind of issue that repeats. I mean, that's also the issue at historic districts in Norfolk and Virginia and other coastal communities.
Yeah, building on fill in a complete coastal environment like that core of Charleston, which, you can basically see the ocean out there. That doesn't seem like a very wise idea, whoever decided to do that.
Seemed like a good idea at the time, I guess, but now we're dealing with the consequences, and it's taking a lot of effort to plan around what can be done there. And Charleston, that historic district, 10 years ago, if someone had said, I'm going to solve this problem for my particular historic home by putting it up on by raising the height of it, people would have objected to that. Because it does change the experience of the place. So, you go to places like Charleston and you walk around, and part of the charm is the way that the buildings relate to each other, the form of the community. And when you change things like that, one house is up on stilts, one of them isn't, you're changing the experience and the specialness, and also the historic integrity would be the way that preservationists would talk about it of the place. But the reality is that with the challenges of sea level rise and climate change, that solutions like that are more and more accepted, and they're happening more and more often. And it's not just that. I mean, that's not the only solution. Not every house is going to be able to be put raised, and that's not going to be the appropriate solution for every house. So, there's a lot of looking for other options, like what type of floodproofing can be done. Wet floodproofing is one option, or dry floodproofing is the other. Wet floodproofing can be lots of different methods, but what it allows is for water to come in and out in a safe way. So it plans for the fact that lower parts of the home or the structure will experience flooding. They'll do things like make sure that all the mechanicals are moved up above where they think the flood line will be. They'll do things like make sure that the home is anchored in, so that those are examples of wet floodproofing approaches. And dry floodproofing is what it sounds like. It's putting in new barriers. I mean, the traditional one is sandbags, right?
Right.
But you got to have notice for that. And when it just flooding happens on, a sunny day, that's not a good solution. So it's experimenting with new ways of putting up moisture barriers and things to just keep the water out. And there's a lot of focus on that kind of thing in communities like Charleston. And Charleston is also, they're looking at a flood wall. They're looking at building a new flood wall with the Army Corps of Engineers. It's another option that's on the table.
That's incredibly costly stuff, though, too, right? That's to build that type of infrastructure. I was in Charleston maybe a year and a half ago and went out to Fort Sumter, which is this incredibly historic place where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. And I don't remember if it was a guide or something I read talking about sea level rise and how it is beginning, to impact and threaten that fort, which is out at the mouth of the kind of harbor there, close to, where the ocean comes in. And I was just thinking about, wow, historic places like this just being impacted or taken away because of what we're facing. Another one that was on the list, Annapolis, Maryland. I lived there for over 9 years, and they had that blue sky flooding also. Right, where you get the high tides, they come in, and you've got water in the streets. I had to sometimes take a different route to get to my kids' school to pick them up because they're like, "Oh, the downtown's flooded. Got to go the back way." I think I saw an article recently where that was one of the cities that is most frequently experiencing this. So what's you want to talk about Annapolis for a minute and what's happening there? It's a very historic town, 300 plus year old buildings and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And the area down the City Harbor area where some of the historic area is, where some of the flooding is most severe, is also one of the key tourism areas for Annapolis. So there, when you have flooding damage, you have impacts to cultural resources, which are valued by the community and visitors, but you also have some major economic impacts on tourism, and this repeat flooding is expensive. A lot of those tourist shops there are small businesses down there, Main Street kinds of businesses that have these repeated issues that have to be dealt with as a result of this recurrent flooding. The National Trust worked with the city of Annapolis and did, in fact, name Annapolis as a national treasure, and worked for several years on some planning initiatives to help with ways to have responses in place for when flooding happens. But it's going to be a continuing problem. And long-term, at Annapolis, in Charleston, Alexandria, Virginia is another place that is experiencing this. It's going to take a lot of funding, a lot of city planning, and really ultimately some federal response to these challenges that are repeating at communities around the country in terms of federal policy approaches and also funding. Yeah.
I think, we're starting to see the rubber hit the road here with climate change, where it's not just this, kind of green hippie issue, if you will. Right now we're seeing the economic impacts in terms of tourism and then needing to invest in these big projects to protect communities. Another area I wanted to talk about is the Tidal Basin in D.C., and a lot of people have been there, maybe a lot of people haven't. So could you describe this place and what's starting to happen to this? I mean, it's incredibly rich history with the monuments and memorials and cherry blossoms and all that stuff.
Yeah, so the Tidal Basin is, an iconic place in America, right? I think even if people haven't been there, most people can sort of conjure it in their mind, what it looks like with the cherry trees around it and the Washington Monument nearby and Jefferson Monument. And I think that people are generally maybe not aware that area is facing a lot of issues as a result of sea level rise and flooding. It's interesting, I think, to understand again, the history of how the tidal basin came to be, to understand the challenges that it's experiencing now. The tidal basin was actually built as flood control originally. It wasn't conceived of as, a national memorial park, monument park type of experience. It was flood control built in response to a major flood in 1881 that was so severe that it blocked southern access to most of the city. And people were going around DC by boat. And so to ameliorate that near the Capitol, the tidal basin was conceived of. And now, almost 90 years later, because of climate change, sea level rise, and also increase in runoff from development is another issue that has contributed to the issues. The water levels in the Potomac there are estimated to have increased by about 11 inches in 90 years. This is also a place where the tidal basin was constructed on man-made land, so it's another fill situation, and it's slowly sinking. So that's part of why you get that high number. It was built as flood control, designed as a park. It had, originally it was like a grandstand and a park with little boats that you could go out and rent and have a day out with your family. The cherry trees came quite a bit later. They came in 1912. They were a gift from Japan. And we actually only shifted to building monuments there in the 1930s. So some of it was, not planned to begin with for the amount of traffic that it now receives in terms of tourism and the amount of use. And so you combine that with the changes in the climate that have happened, and we've got a lot of damage that you can see at the tidal basin. I think people sometimes go there and don't necessarily see it because it is beautiful. They're focused on the big monuments, but if you walk around the basin, you'll see that there are areas where there are no more cherry trees, and it's because the soil has been compacted and trees have died, and because of flooding, sidewalks are cracked, walls are cracked. There have been studies that have estimated something in the neighborhood of $50 million are needed to do full repairs. But in addition to fixing the infrastructure that is there, there also needs to be a plan for long-term resiliency. I mean, we want people to come down to the nation's capital and experience these monuments and learn about the history of the United States. We want people to see these beautiful cherry trees. We also want them to be available 50, 100 years from now. So one of the things that the Trust has done at the tidal basin is to have an ideas lab where we've brought together 5 landscape architecture firms and asked them to come up with some solutions that will help make tourism there sustainable over time and make sure that we have long-term solutions to fixing the sort of flood control problems that are happening that will last and that meet the challenge of the rising sea.
Yeah. Wow. Incredible. You mentioned about stormwater runoff and kind of, the increased precipitation, these heavier rainfall events that we're getting. And, a less coastal community or not a coastal community, Ellicott City, Maryland, is a place that had some really severe, dramatic events in 2016 and 2018, I think. And this is a very historic little downtown area. Could you talk about what happened there and how this is, emblematic of the kind of threats that are out there with climate change?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up because you talk about the tidal basin and everyone has heard of that. But this is an issue that is impacting historic towns around the country. And Ellicott City is it's a 250-year-old little river town community. It's got a historic main street. It also has tourists that come because it is a good way to spend an afternoon, do some antiquing. It's that kind of beautiful, quaint place. But yes, in the past few years, there have been a couple of rain events that have resulted in flash flooding that hurt property, but also was really a risk to life. And what's happened in those situations, what the engineering folks going back and looking at what happened, it's not that the Patapsco River, which is the river that's right there at Ellicott City, is rising. It's actually tributaries that are flowing into the river are getting channelization from all of the sprawl and concrete that has been laid, the hard surfaces that have been laid in the past few decades that are channeling these extreme rains down into the tributaries and then forcing them almost like a funnel through the downtown historic area of the city. So it's a real concern, and it's it's one of those things where I think we hear a lot about sea level rise and coastal communities, but extreme rain is something that is being experienced in places around the country. And I should also say that Ellicott is it's a Main Street community, and so in National Trust world, in the historic preservation world, that has a particular meaning. One of our partners and subsidiaries is called the National Main Street Center, and they work with Main Street communities around the country on economic development that's focused on preservation and tourism. And we're just starting to see these kinds of issues in communities around the country, but Ellicott is an extreme example where really, sort of 100-year event happened in quick succession and caused a lot of damage.
Yeah, I would suggest people kind of go online and just Google, the flooding in Ellicott City, and you'll be surprised at just how dramatic it was. I mean, we're talking about basically a river running right down that main street and scouring buildings and taking away cars, and it was scary stuff. I think along the way you've mentioned some of the specific ways to address some of these problems, but big picture, what do you think are the approaches, the ways to try to achieve preservation in the face of water-related impacts of climate change? Solutions.
Yeah.
Solutions are
Solutions. Yeah.
I mean, you got to throw a ton of money at these things. We've identified that, but yeah, what else would you say?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to take a lot of different things coming together. Communities are going to have to decide what they want to prioritize and do the type of planning and hardening before these events occur. So, we talked about wet and dry flood proofing. Those are things that can happen. There are programs that can help with funding on some of that. There's also sort of some work to be done about looking at, this is pretty wonky, but looking at materials. There is some evidence that historic building materials are actually more resilient to water inundation than some of the more modern sort of post-1970 materials that have been used, but there's not been a whole lot of research about that, or a lot of research about how to manage the flooding. There's actually a really neat program being proposed by Preservation Virginia that will hopefully get fully funded to look at some of the ways that pre-1970s materials should be prioritized for when there is an issue, to make sure that they stay in place, because they actually long-term stand up better to repeated water events. And so there's some wonky material science pieces of it that need to be teased out. And then I also think that there must be a federal response to all of the causes of climate change, to the ways that we as a nation are going to deal with the effects of climate change. The National Trust and the historic preservation community, we are seeing these impacts come to our downtowns, and it's real. And it needs a federal level policy response.
Sure. One of the agencies I think that's involved is the National Park Service. Could you talk a little bit about the role that they play in preservation and how they have or are helping deal with some of these pressures?
Yeah. So the National Park Service is the federal agency that is responsible for historic preservation policy in the United States. One of the things that they do that I think is somewhat visible to the public is they lead the National Register of Historic Places. So when you go on a trip and you see one of those plaques that says listed on the National Register, that's the National Park Service, that's the Department of the Interior. But they also have a program called the Certified Local Government Program. That is a program, it's a CLG program. That's a program that gets appropriations through the Historic Preservation Fund from Congress. And communities that become CLG or Certified Local Government make a commitment to preserving resources in their community. So they make a commitment to historic preservation, and then they have access to funding through the Park Service and their state historic preservation office for technical assistance and for planning. So the Park Service helps to manage. I think people think national parks, iconic national parks, but they also have a local planning role, particularly focused on making sure that our historic communities are protected. So that's one of the things that they do. And on the point of how does that impact with climate change and flooding and disaster response, they do, some of their planning monies go to disaster planning. So for example, disaster planning for historic preservation would be making sure that you have good surveys in place of what historic resources are there, what is valued by the community, so that when there is an emergency, first responders can have a sense of what it is that is around them. And when they are asked to make quick decisions about safety, they know that if they can preserve a historic place because it is valuable to the community, that they will, because it's been identified in planning documents prior. So things like that can help. The Park Service also has technical experts on things like materials, like we were talking earlier. And they've pulled together guidance on things like how to recover if your historic home or your historic building is flooded. And so they have a lot of technical expertise that's available to the public and also to state and local agencies.
Right. And, we mentioned earlier the Great American Outdoors Act. And so I guess, there's going to be a lot of resources there that can maybe help with this great puzzle, right?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing that the Park Service has, which is a big bullhorn, right? Everybody's heard of the Park Service. They know that the Park Service, part of their responsibility is to save historic places, iconic ones around the country. And, they have an opportunity to talk about issues that they're facing at their own sites, like what you were talking about earlier at Fort Sumter, to help people understand sort of the range of impacts that the effects of climate change are having on historic resources, and sort of, increase the sense of urgency and the need for action.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question I have for you is, a person out there that's really concerned and wants to help preserve historic places. What can they do?
Well, I have to put in the plug. I mean, one of the things that you can do would be to follow the National Trust on social media. We put out regularly advocacy opportunities so that if you want to tell your congressional representative that you support preservation, you support conservation, if you are happy about the Great American Outdoors Act, we help make it easy for you to know how to make those outreaches on the Hill. And I also say that get involved locally. There are Main Street organizations, local history organizations, there are local museums, there's your statewide preservation organizations, and they need your help. They are always looking for support and volunteers. So if this is of interest to you, you will find the cultural resource preservation community is broad enough that you'll find something that will speak to you in terms of a volunteer opportunity.
Awesome. Well, Sharee, this has been a very informative conversation. I appreciate it so much. And, things are kind of strange right now with coronavirus and being able to travel and visit places. But I mean, I'm desperate to get back out there and explore some history myself. But thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Travis. This was great. Appreciate the opportunity.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish choice for conserving water, energy, and money while enjoying an invigorating shower. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.